The farm was called Hinterkaifeck. The name is Bavarian German, and it refers to the hamlet of Kaifeck, and to the position of the farm in relation to that hamlet, hinter meaning behind, or beyond, in the sense of further from the road, further from the village, further from other people. The name was, in a sense, a description. Hinterkaifeck was the farm at the back of nowhere. It stood about 70 kilometers north of Munich, near the small town of Weidhofen in what is now the district of Schrobenhausen. The landscape here is flat agricultural land, fields of grain and sugar beet, stands of forest that break the horizon, the long straight roads of the Bavarian plain connecting villages that are close enough in distance but far enough in feeling that life on a farm between them could be, and often was, quite solitary. In March 1922, Hinterkaifeck was home to 6 people. Andreas Gruber, 63, was the farmer, a difficult man by reputation, proud and stubborn and not well liked by his neighbors. His wife, Cecilia Gruber, née Baumgartner, was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, lived with them along with her 2 children, Cecilia, a 7-year-old girl named after her grandmother, and Joseph, a 2-year-old boy. And the farm's maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, who had arrived at the farm just one day before the murders. It was her first day of work there. The previous maid had left. The previous maid had left because she was afraid. Her name was Crescence Rieger, and she had worked at Hinterkaifeck for some months before giving notice in late 1921. She told people who asked, and people did ask, because leaving a farm job in winter was unusual, that the farm was haunted. Strange things happened there. She heard sounds she could not explain. She felt, she said, that something was wrong, and she could not stay. Crescence Rieger sensed that something was wrong is easy to dismiss in retrospect. She had no specific information about what was about to happen. The word haunted, applied by a Bavarian farm worker in 1921, may refer to nothing more than the particular quality of isolation that a remote farm has in the long dark evenings of a German winter. She may have been superstitious, or uncomfortable, or simply unhappy in her work. People leave jobs for many reasons. But she was not wrong. The world that Andreas Gruber and his family occupied in March 1922 was the world of rural Bavaria in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. The war had ended 3.5 years earlier, and the peace that followed was not peaceful. Germany was in the middle of the social and political upheaval that would eventually produce the Weimar Republic and, later, the rise of National Socialism. Inflation was destroying savings. Veterans were struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The countryside was experiencing a combination of economic stress and political anxiety that made the ordinary difficulties of farm life feel heavier. Hinterkaifeck was not insulated from any of this. The Gruber family's finances were under pressure. Andreas Gruber was a stubborn man who did not borrow money and did not easily ask for help, and the combination of his personality and the economic circumstances made the farm something of an island, productive but isolated, self-sufficient but disconnected. There was also, within the family, a darker strain of difficulty. Victoria Gabriel's husband had died during the war. This was the official account, though there were rumors in the village that the marriage had other complications. And there were persistent rumors, never proven, never formally investigated at the time, about the nature of Andreas Gruber's relationship with his own daughter Victoria. These rumors involved Cecilia, Victoria's daughter, in ways that were unambiguous and deeply disturbing. They were the kind of rumors that circulate in small communities around families that have withdrawn from normal social contact, that generate discomfort and avoidance rather than direct confrontation. Whether the rumors were accurate, we do not know. What we know is that the family at Hinterkaifeck was not happy, that they were isolated from their community in ways that went beyond mere geography, and that in the weeks before the murders, something had begun to go wrong in ways that Andreas Gruber himself noticed and was unsettled by. Andreas Gruber talked about it with his neighbors and with the local locksmith in the days before his death. He was not a man who talked easily. His reputation in the village was for reticence and stubbornness, and the fact that he talked about this at all suggests that it was disturbing him considerably. He had found footprints in the snow. The footprints led from the forest at the edge of his property, across the field, to the farm. They did not lead back. He had followed them himself, tracing their path from the tree line to the farmyard, looking for where they ended or where their maker had gone. They ended at the farm. They did not return to the forest. He had heard sounds in the attic above the main farmhouse. Not the sounds of animals, not the creaking of wood settling in the cold, but sounds that suggested occupancy, movement, weight, presence. He had gone to investigate and found nothing. A set of keys had disappeared. A newspaper had appeared in the house that neither Andreas nor anyone else in the family had brought in, a newspaper from the previous day, placed somewhere in the farmhouse as if someone had read it and set it aside. Small things had moved. Objects had appeared and disappeared in ways that had no explanation. He told people about these things. He was not a man who told stories or sought attention, and the people who heard him believed that he was telling them what he had genuinely observed. They had no useful response. They did not call the police. They did not investigate further. The Bavarian countryside of 1922 did not have the infrastructure or the culture of rapid response that we might expect today. They listened, and they were unsettled, and they went home. Shortly before the murders, Andreas Gruber spoke with his neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer about the footprints and the sounds. Schlittenbauer would later become a significant figure in the investigation. His relationship with the Gruber family was more complicated than simple neighborliness. He may have been the father of Victoria's young son Joseph, though this was never established conclusively. He told Gruber he didn't know what to make of the footprints. He offered no solution. The murders occurred sometime in the late evening of Friday, March 31st, or the early hours of Saturday, April 1st, 1922. They were not discovered until Tuesday, April 4th. The farm was discovered by neighbors who had become concerned. 3 days had passed without any sign of life at Hinterkaifeck. The post had not been collected. The cattle, audible from the road, were lowing in a way that suggested they had not been fed. The smoke that normally rose from the farmhouse chimney was not rising. Lorenz Schlittenbauer assembled a small group, himself and 2 other neighbors, and they went to the farm to investigate. They found the farm apparently normal from the outside. The buildings were intact. Nothing was visibly disturbed. They entered the barn. Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old Kazilia were in the barn. They had been killed there, struck with a bladed tool, almost certainly a mattock or a pickaxe, with considerable force and evident deliberateness. The bodies had been there for several days. The investigators found them covered, partially, with hay. In the farmhouse, they found the 2-year-old Joseph in his cot and the maid Maria Baumgartner in her room. Both had been killed in their beds with the same kind of bladed tool. 6 people, killed with what the subsequent autopsy would determine was a single weapon, used by a single attacker or at most 2. The pathologist's examination established, from the wounds, that the 4 victims in the barn had not died quickly. The 7-year-old Kazilia had been alive for some time after the initial blows, long enough to pull out tufts of her own hair, which were found clenched in her hands. This detail was reported in the press at the time and has been one of the most disturbing elements of the case in the century since. It is not included here for its shock value, but because it is relevant to understanding the sequence of events. Whatever happened in that barn, it was not instantaneous. The killer or killers had time, an awareness of time, and some relationship to the space they were in that allowed for the extended duration the evidence implies. The police investigation that began on April 4, 1922 established several things quickly and several things not at all. The weapon was never found. The investigators knew from the wound patterns what kind of implement had been used, a mattock, the specific agricultural tool used for breaking hard ground, with a blade on one side and a pick on the other. This was a tool available on any farm in Bavaria. Its absence from Hinterkaifeck was noted, its presence never recovered. The crime scene, by the standards of 1922 forensic investigation, was compromised. 3 days had passed before discovery. The neighbors who found the bodies had moved through the farm, handling things, before the police arrived. The weather had been variable. The physical evidence was incomplete. But the detail that investigators found most disturbing, the detail that has made Hinterkaifeck something more than an ordinary murder case for 100 years, was not a question of forensic evidence. It was a question of what the farm itself showed had happened after the murders. Someone had stayed. The cattle had been fed. Not on Friday, not on the night of the murders, but in the days afterward, someone had entered the barn where the bodies lay and given the cattle their feed. The hay that was found partially covering the bodies in the barn had been moved and replaced. The kitchen showed evidence of recent use, food had been taken from the farmhouse stores, a fire had been lit in the stove. For at least 2 days, possibly 3, after killing 6 people, someone had been living at Hinterkaifeck. Sleeping in the farmhouse, eating from the farmhouse kitchen, going about the ordinary routines of farm maintenance in a barn that contained 4 bodies covered in hay. This is the detail that changes the character of the Hinterkaifeck case. A murder followed by flight is horrifying but comprehensible. A person who commits violence and runs is behaving according to patterns we can recognize and understand. A person who commits violence and stays, who maintains the routines of ordinary life in the presence of the dead, who feeds the cattle and eats the food and sleeps in the house, this is something else. This is either a psychology so unusual as to be almost without precedent, or a situation so specific and so unusual that ordinary frameworks do not apply. We do not know which. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders lasted, in various forms, for decades. It was conducted first by local police, then by Munich criminal investigators, then by forensic specialists brought in as the complexity of the case became apparent. It generated hundreds of pages of documentation, interviewed over 100 witnesses, and produced numerous suspects. It never produced a conviction. The early investigation identified several categories of suspect. There were people known to have had conflicts with Andreas Gruber. The family's social isolation had not prevented disputes, and some of those disputes had been acrimonious. There were people with connections to Victoria, whose personal life was more complicated than the farm's isolation might suggest. There were itinerant workers and tramps who had been seen in the area in the days around the murders. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had led the discovery party and who had a complex relationship with the Gruber family, was investigated more than once. He had motive. In some interpretations, if he was the father of Joseph, his relationship with Victoria and the Gruber family was entangled in ways that might have produced conflict. He was known to be a difficult man, capable of violence in certain circumstances. He had knowledge of the farm and its layout. He had been one of the first people on the scene after the discovery, which could indicate either concern or a return to the scene. He was never charged. The evidence against him was circumstantial, and the circumstantial evidence was ambiguous. He maintained until his death that he had nothing to do with the murders. The investigation was interrupted by the larger events of German history. The economic and political chaos of the Weimar period, the rise of the Nazi regime, the Second World War, each of these, in succession, disrupted the continuity of the investigation and resulted in the loss of evidence and records. Some files were destroyed. Some investigators died. Some witnesses disappeared into the upheavals of the 1930s and 1940s. After the war, the case was periodically revived. In 1951, a Munich newspaper commissioned a new investigation by a criminologist. In 1986, the case was reviewed again by Bavarian police. Each review produced renewed interest, new theories, and ultimately the same conclusion: insufficient evidence to charge anyone. In 2007, students at a Munich police training academy were given the Hinterkaifeck case as an exercise in historical criminal investigation. They spent months working through the available documentation, applying modern analytical techniques to the evidence that had been preserved. Their work was unusually thorough, and their conclusion was the one that every previous investigation had reached: the case could not be solved on the available evidence. What the students' investigation did contribute was a more systematic analysis of the existing suspects and their plausibility. Working through the full list of people investigated over the decades, they identified one suspect who seemed, on the available evidence, more plausible than the others: a drifter who had been seen in the area and who had connections to the region that could explain his knowledge of the farm. But the evidence for this suspect was not sufficient for conviction, and the identity of the Hinterkaifeck killer, or killers, remains formally undetermined. One of the things the students noted was the significance of the pre-murder period, the weeks during which Andreas Gruber had been noticing the footprints and the sounds and the displaced objects. Their analysis suggested that whoever committed the murders had spent a significant period observing the farm before acting. The footprints in the snow leading from the forest, the ones with no return track, were interpreted not as a single visit but as evidence of a sustained period of covert presence. Someone had been watching Hinterkaifeck for some time before March 31st. The implications of this are disturbing. Whoever killed the Gruber family was not acting impulsively, not responding to a sudden quarrel or a moment of rage. They had chosen the farm, watched it, identified the routines and vulnerabilities of its inhabitants, and waited for a moment to act. This is premeditated violence of a sustained and calculated kind. Why? What did they want? The farm had no particular riches. There was some cash, which may have been taken, though the investigation was never certain of this. The Gruber family had no obvious enemies of a kind that would generate this level of premeditated violence. The rumors about Andreas Gruber's relationship with his daughter, if they were accurate and if someone with knowledge of them decided to act on that knowledge, might provide a motive of a certain kind. But no evidence connecting any specific person to any specific motive was ever established. The question of who stayed at the farm after the murders remains among the most unsettling aspects of the case. The investigators who documented the post-murder evidence, the fed cattle, the used kitchen, the disturbed hay, were working in 1922 without the forensic tools that would now be applied to such evidence. They established that someone had been there. They could not establish who, or in what state of mind, or what the staying meant about the person who had killed 6 people and then remained. One interpretation is practical: the killer needed time to search the farm, to find whatever they had come for, and used the maintained routine as cover. A farm that appeared normal from the road would not trigger alarm, and the cattle had to be fed or their noise would attract attention. On this reading, the staying was coldly rational, a calculated extension of the premeditated act. Another interpretation is psychological. The killer could not leave. Whether through some inability to separate from the scene of the act, some need to remain in proximity to what had been done, some failure of the ordinary human drive to flee from violence and its consequences, this interpretation suggests a psychological state that goes beyond the merely criminal into something less classifiable. We have no evidence that resolves the question. We have the fact of the staying, and we have the fact that the staying ended before the farm was discovered, and we have no record of where the person who stayed went when they left. The farm at Hinterkaifeck no longer exists. The buildings were demolished in 1923, the year after the murders. The decision to demolish was partly practical and partly, one imagines, a response to the horror the place had become in the community's imagination. The site was ploughed and returned to agricultural use. There is nothing there now that would indicate, to a visitor with no knowledge of the history, that anything had ever happened. The bodies of the 6 victims were buried in the local cemetery. In 1951, the remains were exhumed as part of a renewed investigation and subjected to further forensic analysis. They were then reburied. The graves are still there, in the cemetery of the village of Weidhofen, marked simply with the names and dates. What does Hinterkaifeck ask of us, 100 years later? It is not, in the first instance, a historical mystery in the way that Sanxingdui or the Dyatlov Pass are historical mysteries. It is not a question of civilizational origin or geological catastrophe. It is a crime. A human being, or possibly 2, chose to kill 6 people on a farm in Bavaria on a March evening in 1922. That choice was made for reasons that were comprehensible to the person who made them, even if those reasons remain opaque to us. The horror of Hinterkaifeck is a human horror, without the impersonal scale of natural disaster or the temporal distance of ancient history. And yet the specific shape of what happened, the weeks of invisible occupation, the footprints without return tracks, the sounds in the attic, the newspaper that appeared from nowhere, the days spent at the farm after the killings, has a quality that goes beyond ordinary criminality. It has the quality of someone who existed in relationship to the farm and its inhabitants in a way that was invisible to them, that preceded the violence by weeks, that continued after the violence for days. A presence that was there before it acted and remained after it had acted, as if the farm and the person who killed its occupants were, for a time, in a kind of terrible proximity that neither entry nor exit fully describes. This is the detail that has made Hinterkaifeck persist in the cultural memory for a century. Not the violence itself. There have been many crimes as terrible, and most of them are forgotten. But the quality of the presence, invisible before, invisible after, never identified. The footprints that led to the farm and stopped. The sounds in the attic. The fed cattle. The fire in the kitchen stove. There is a category of experience that most people have had at some point, the sense that a space has been occupied in your absence, that something in a room is slightly different from how you left it, that the arrangement of objects does not quite match your memory. Usually this has a mundane explanation, a family member, a cleaner, your own imperfect memory of where you left things. But the sensation itself, the particular quality of noticing that a space you consider private has been entered, used, known, is among the more unsettling that ordinary life produces. Andreas Gruber lived with that sensation for weeks. He noticed it. He spoke about it. He was clearly disturbed by it. And he did not find an explanation, and he did not find a way out, and on a Friday evening in late March 1922 the explanation resolved itself in the barn. The case files from the Hinterkaifeck investigation are stored in the Bavarian State Archives in Munich. They run to several hundred pages, accumulated over decades of intermittent investigation. They are available to researchers. They have been examined many times by many people with various forms of expertise. They have not produced a conviction. They have not produced a name. The person who walked out of the forest and into the farmyard, who slept in the attic and ate in the kitchen and killed 6 people and stayed for 3 days and then left, that person is not in the files in any form that allows identification. They may have died shortly after, in the chaos of 1920s Germany. They may have lived a long life somewhere, carrying what they had done at Hinterkaifeck as a private knowledge that went with them to their own death. They are, a century later, as invisible as they were when Andreas Gruber followed their footprints across the snow and found that the track stopped at his own farmyard. The footprints led in. They did not lead out. We never found where they went. Sleep well.